Todd. I have no idea about what he does, but it sounds really fascinating, so we're happy to have you here today. So Todd is an associate professor here in Department of Journalism and Media Studies at Rutgers. He's trained as a socio-cultural anthropologist, and his research focuses on the convergence of new media and social movements. He's the author of a couple of prominent books. One is called Digital Rebellion, The Birth of the Cyber Left. Sounds fascinating. And more recently, co-edited a volume called The Great Refusal, Herbert Marcuse, is that right? Marcuse, and Contemporary Social Movements. He's won a number of awards. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Inaugural Social Activist Award from Critical Cultural Studies Division of the National Communications Association, as well as the Clarion Award from the Association of Women in Communication, and an Investigative Reporting Award from the National Association of Black Journalists. Also co-founder of the Media Mobilizing Project, which sounds great, which uses media and communications as a core strategy for building a movement of poor and working people in Philadelphia and beyond. And today Todd will be talking about the rise of the cyber left, technology, capitalism, and contemporary social movements. So please join me in welcoming Todd.
Hey everyone, how's everyone doing?
Good.
Let me see if I can get this back up here. Let's hope so. I'll see if there's why we can't. Oh, we got this. That'll come later. This. All right, so I want to thank Erica and Dr. Gobert, sorry, and the doctoral students for inviting me here, so I really appreciate that. And as I was saying, it's good to be at the Graduate School of Education. Actually, I got my PhD at Penn, and I got it both in the Anthro department and in the Graduate School of Education at Penn. So, and I don't think I've done anything in a Graduate School of Education since I've finished. So, thanks, I'm appreciative of it. So today, as Janice was saying, I'm going to talk a little bit about one of my recent books, Digital Rebellion, Birth of the Cyber Left, and then a broader research agenda I have focused on social movements and technology. And I'll say at the outset, I imagine it's somewhat far afield for the ed school. So, but even though it might be a far afield from your research, it's not far afield from what we're seeing in the world right now. So I think there'll be places of intersection that should be interesting. So with the book and my broader research agenda, the general vision is to map an underlying logic of resistance, and one that I think all of us in this room have become increasingly aware of as resistance movements and protests have erupted across the world and entered the world stage. And here we're talking about places like North Africa and the Middle East, Zuccotti Park, Ferguson, more recently, that's me, sorry, North Dakota. And also we could even say the things that we're starting to watch in response to the recent election, right? So we've all sort of seen something, a moment of resistance that's emerged, and a different one than what historically, the way resistance movements have historically played out. And so for me, in order to understand this new form of resistance, this new logic is what I'll really work on talking about. I, in my initial research, undertook a ethnographic and historical mapping project. So I looked at what was called the Global Justice Movement from 1994 to 2006, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that. And I did it was a deep ethnography. I spent about 3 years involved in it, but also I did a lot of oral history, and I'll talk a little bit about that. And I had a particular focus on two movements. One is the indie media movement, which is a media-oriented movement that emerged in 1999, and the other is a group called the Zapatista Army of National Liberation, which grew out of Mexico and started in the 80s and emerged prominently in 1994. And it's important to note that these two movements, the indie media movement and the Zapatistas and the bigger global justice movement, they precede the wave of resistance we're actually watching right now by less than a decade. But in many ways, the strategies and tactics of that period already seem quaint. They seem outdated. So here's a cheesy metaphor alert. I'm going to argue to you today that much like the objects in the rearview mirror, that the the Zapatistas and the global justice movement are actually much closer than they appear. And so if we want to be able to understand what happened in Cairo, what's happening with Black Lives Matter to some degree, what happened in Zuccotti Park, then what's happening with the protests around No DAPL, or the Dakota Access Pipeline, we need to understand what happened in the 90s and 2000s, because much of the logic was seeded there. In this sense, we can think of, and this is some of the larger kind of arguments I make, we can think of the global justice movement and the more recent uprisings as two successive waves in a broader epoch of contention. I use this concept of the cyber left to tie this whole period from, I think it's actually in the 80s, but let's just say 94 to the present, as one broad epoch, right? With a set of similar logics that I will talk about connect to their relationship, both to the changes in capitalism and the changes in technology that we've seen. So at this broad level, extending the cyclical theory of social movements put forward by scholars, these are sociologists and political scientists like Charles Tilly and Sidney Tarrow, I argue that the patterns of struggle in a particular period are best understood as developing in a multilateral dialogue, a dialogue between social movement actors and their institutions, and on one hand, the long history of resistance that they inherit. So that's a picture of the sleeping car, Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, which was a union that, who in the early part of the 20th century, A.R. Philip Randolph was like a leader of it, also an important leader of the civil rights movement. So that's the history people kind of inherit. But it's not just the history. The activists are also in conversation with their social, material, technological present and economic present. So here I have Wall Street to symbolize the material present that people are in dialogue with. Using this lens to understand social movement practice, what I argue is we can begin to understand what the differences and commonalities are between something like Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which is an important movement throughout the 60s, or Student for a Democratic Society, also an important 60s movement on one hand, but then understand what its differences and commonalities are with the global justice movement or Occupy Wall Street on the other. And I'll get a little bit more into that in a bit. But I'm an ethnographer. And at some point, being an ethnographer, being trained, they maybe shot me with a serum or did something that said, you must begin with a story. So I have to, it's genetically programmed, I have to follow that. So I'm going to take you back to the emergence of the global justice movement, particularly the birth of the Zapatistas, who I mentioned before, and their intersection with the indie media movement. So to do that, I want to take you back to Chiapas. Chiapas is the southernmost state of Mexico, and I want to take you to January 1st, 1994, which is the day the North American Free Trade Agreement was due to go into effect, NAFTA. The Zapatista Army of National Liberation was largely Mayan peasants, so largely people making their living off the land as farmers, right? Subsistence farming, right? So not large-scale farming, but small-scale farming that mostly let people eat. They rose up and they seized multiple towns and the capital of the state of Chiapas, and they declared war on the Mexican government. And they argued specifically that NAFTA was going to be a death knell to their way of life. So their argument was very simple, that free trade across the Americas, free trade as they would call it because it wasn't necessarily free, was going to flood the Mexican market with U.S. corn, which was largely federally subsidized and also genetically modified. And it was going to flood the Mexican market, and it was going to make it impossible for them to make their living off subsistence farming. And so they predicted that people in rural parts of Mexico were going to be forced off the land and into the cities. And so this was their major concern. And if we look back post-NAFTA, what we see from most research is that there was a massive internal migration in Mexico from rural parts of the country to the city, exacerbating a certain form of urban poverty that exists there, right? So their thoughts were correct. So given this, they declared war on the government. They said they were going to overthrow the Mexican government. They were going to march to Mexico City from Chiapas, and they were going to do this in honor of, for, and with all poor, all dispossessed of Mexico. That was their saying. They had a bunch of communiques that went out. In the weeks to follow, there was a short war between the two sides. But the Zapatistas, they failed. And it could be because they wore these black masks, I don't know. But they failed to call the rest of the poor of Mexico into this resistance. And so they were outnumbered, they were outmatched, and they were isolated in the southern part of the country. And it's at this moment that they decide to make a retreat into the mountains, and it's the same moment that the Mexican military was saying, we're going to end this, right? We're going to end this insurrection, and we're going to bring peace back to Mexico. But it's also 1994, and the internet is just arriving, right? It's just becoming something public. So with people who recognized that NAFTA was on its way, and there was all these listservs that sort of developed in order to organize the communities around fighting back against NAFTA and protecting indigenous communities. And the Zapatistas, now there's an irony here, the Zapatistas are in rural Mexico, which has got a 94, less than 1% internet density, right? But nonetheless, they take advantage of all these listservs and they put out a series of communiques through them, and they call on people to support their struggle. And it worked. So one scholar, D.D. Hallett, called this the email heard around the world. But what happened was hundreds of thousands of people flooded into Chiapas, Mexico, Mexico City, New York, and D.C. and Toronto. And they demanded a ceasefire, and it worked. So the Mexican military stopped, the Zapatistas stopped, and they went into peace accords. And actually the Zapatistas at that point in time won a lot of things in those peace accords. They won autonomy over their land, control over their education, control over their health care, which were some of their major demands. So following this struggle, the Zapatistas, it's not like today. Today we see a lot of uprisings, right? Every week there's a protest. You know, we see North Dakota, we see Black Lives Matter. We're in a moment, what I would tell you is a moment of resistance, but the 90s was not a moment of particular resistance. Because of that, the Zapatistas became the cause célèbre, right? They became the social movement that everybody was interested in on the left globally, right? The New York Times called, and they also had used technology in an interesting way, so people were very interested in them. The New York Times called the Zapatistas the first postmodern revolutionary group. Manuel Castells, if anyone reads them, he called them the first informational guerrilla movement. Another scholar, an economist from UT Austin, called them the exemplification of an electronic fabric of struggle. So everyone's trying to grapple with this peasant movement and their relationship to technology. So the Zapatistas seize on this, they call a bunch of meetings, and they call for the development of a network of struggle. They say, okay, we can't fight alone. We failed calling in the rest of the Mexican society to our struggle. We're calling the world into a struggle. And so it was that call that led to the development of the global justice movement. So many of the organizations that emerged in that moment then came up, and they came up because of that call. And it wasn't just inspiration. It wasn't just a set of ideas. It was material. So I want to show you the material relations. So we're in New York City in 1997 at a conference called Freeing the Media. And a bunch of US and Canadian media activists, and this is a newly emerging kind of breed of activists connected to the internet, right? They have this meeting in downtown Manhattan, and they decide that they want the keynote to be Subcomandante Marcos, who is the spokesperson for the Zapatistas. So they call him up, somehow they get in touch with him, and he says, I am not coming up to New York, but I'll send you a message, a video message, right? And so they're in this room. Let me see if I can bring this video up. Sorry. It's downtown Manhattan, and then there's this, right?
Por la humanidad y contra el neoliberalismo, principios de agosto de 1996, llamábamos a crear una red de medios de comunicación independiente, una red de información. Estábamos pensando en eso, en una red que permitiera resistir el poder de la mentira y el engaño que se empieza a gestar para poder vender esta guerra, la Cuarta Guerra Mundial, decimos nosotros. Esto es necesario para poder resistir no solo en los movimientos sociales, sino también ese proyecto de vida y ese proyecto político, ese proyecto de la humanidad que es el derecho a la información crítica y verdadera. Nosotros queríamos saludarlos a todos ustedes, reconocerles el trabajo que han hecho, no solo para que la lucha de los pueblos indígenas se conozca, sino también que otras luchas se conozcan y que los grandes acontecimientos mundiales puedan ser vistos de una forma crítica. Ojalá, esperamos que su reunión tenga éxito y que se pueda concretar en acuerdos de esta red, de este intercambio, de este apoyo mutuo que debe haber entre trabajadores de la cultura y de los medios de información que trabajan de forma independiente. Esperamos que alguna vez podamos asistir personalmente a su encuentro, a su conferencia, o que en el peor de los casos algún día puedan hacer esa conferencia en territorio donde estemos nosotros, donde podamos llegar nosotros para poder escuchar su palabra y que ustedes puedan oír la nuestra personalmente. Por ahora pues aprovechamos el apoyo de la Comisión Nacional para la Democracia y el uso del sistema de video para poder mandarles este saludo. Así que good luck. I don't know, my English is okay, but good luck and so long. Good.
Okay. So he sends this video up, and back to this. Sorry about that. So he sends this video up, right? And I want to flag two things that he says there. One, he says, all right, we've already made this call for a global network of movements. Now I want to make this call for a global media network. I want you to build a global media network. Take advantage of the internet and build it. And then the other thing he says is, this is a vision. You're in New York. You have your work to do. Go ahead and get it done, basically. He says, go make some concrete plans for this. Get on with it. And I would be remiss not to mark some of the romanticized, fetishized aspects of this, right? So we're in New York City. A guy's got a balaclava on. He's got a machine gun over his shoulder. There's a horse in the background. It's rural Mexico. And there's something there. I'm not going to go there now, but obviously that's there. So many of the founders of what then became the indie media movement were in the room on this day. They were in New York, and they decided that they were going to take this idea and they were going to make it flesh. Right, so we're going to jump forward to 1999 in Seattle on the eve of World Trade Organization ministerial meetings in late November. Two software programmers, Matt Arneson and Mance Jacoby, post the first message to a newly created open publishing news site called indiemedia.org. And they write, "Welcome to Indie Media. The resistance is now global. A trans-Pacific collaboration has brought this website into existence. The web dramatically alters the balance between multinational and activist media. With just a bit of coding, some cheap equipment, we can set up a live, automated website that rivals the corporates. Prepare to be swamped by the tide of activist media makers on the ground in Seattle and around the world telling the real story behind the World Trade Organization meetings." So Arneson and Jacoby's prophecy turned out to be on target. In the days to come, thousands of journalists, activists, organizers, and citizens responded to the call, and a new independent media center, as well as the city of Seattle, were swamped by activist media makers. With hundreds of volunteers on the ground and millions of visitors turning to a new participatory media portal, the indie media movement was born. The initial mission of the indie media movement was to be a citizen newsroom that offered journalists and others multiple media-based platforms, internet, print, radio, video, for journalists, activists, and citizens to report on the WTO meetings. One of the founders, Jeff Pearlstein, who was also in the room in New York, said to me in an interview, he said, look, two things were going on. One, we were driven by this call from the Zapatistas, but two, we were looking at all this media around us, and we were like, we got to take advantage of it. We can't let Fox and CNN be the ones to tell our stories. We got to build a platform to tell our own stories. So that was the vision that they brought in. As it turned out, they put in quite a week. During the uprising in Seattle, the municipal government lost control of the city. The police were forced to set curfew. The WTO meetings were shut down. President Clinton was in complete support of the WTO, of the free trade agreement and WTO, until this happened. During the protests, he had to walk back his support. He said something like, the kids in the street, and it wasn't kids, but nonetheless, they have some points here. We should take this seriously. The 600 people were arrested. The police chief of Seattle was fired. And many thought that this was a crystallizing moment for the global justice movement writ large. And so people know what the global justice movement is. It's now 17 years ago, 18 years ago. When it was working well, there were 4 major arms to it, 4 different areas. So there was a bunch of people who were really focused on democracy. They were concerned with supranational decision-making bodies like NAFTA and the WTO, drawing up the rules for how the economy works and being farther and farther distanced from a representative democratic apparatus, right? So you're no longer voting for anybody who's going and making these decisions. You're voting for somebody that then appoints somebody that then is sitting in a room. And so there's a lot of unease around democracy, right? So then there's one plank of this was democratic, people focused on democracy, particularly as it pertained to the economy, global economy. There's another plank which was indigenous communities that were concerned that free trade was going to screw them over, like the Zapatistas, excuse my language. And then there was both labor and environmental activists that were concerned that free trade was going to create a race to the bottom, where the countries with the least labor standards and the least environmental standards were going to be the countries where corporations went, and then every other country would be competing with those countries, lowering their environmental and labor standards in this race to the bottom. So those were the sets of concerns, and when the global justice movement was operating well, those 4 planks came together. So, over the course of the Seattle uprising, the Independent Media Center, which was brand new, just emerged then, was a fledgling organization, called hundreds of volunteers into the process of media making and journalism. Through a practice of providing grassroots coverage of the protests, an innovative journalistic ethos, and a new breed of urban citizen journalist / activist emerged, armed with pad, pencil, camcorder, cell phone, and these bright green makeshift press passes that they created. And so I talked to a New York Times journalist who worked for New York Times during the Seattle uprising, and he said he made a decision about a day into the uprising that the way he was going to find stories was he was going to look for multiple press passes. So he was sort of seeing this network logic operating, this distributed network logic. So indie media was in contact with hundreds of people on the street. They would send out a dispatch, tell people to go to 4th and, I don't know the streets in Seattle, 4th and X. A bunch of indie media reporters would go there, and the New York Times journalist followed them. And that's how he did his reporting for the week. And the IMC gave out 400 press passes that week, giving people the capacity to document their worlds. One of the computer programmers who did the programming for the website, which I'll show you in a minute, said the Independent Media Center revolutionized the way media works. Clearly, this is a hyperbolic statement, right? It's over the top a little bit, but, and I'll say this in a minute, there is some parts to it that we need to think about. So, in the course of the Battle of Seattle, the Independent Media Center citizen journalists filmed and edited 5 documentaries, one each day, that were shot by hundreds of people and edited by dozens of people, and then uplinked by satellite and played in community centers around the country. They had a newspaper. I think it was first called The Grind, and then they renamed it The Blind Spot, or vice versa. Seattle, so they had to name it after a coffee. They had a low-power FM radio station that broadcast throughout the week. They had a photo station. Right, so they had all this media. And I was going to show some of the videos that they produced, but I think in the interest of time I won't. But the backbone of the news center was the website, right? Because it's 99, the internet is just coming into its own. The creation of the software behind this website was a global project that brought together programmers as far afield as Australia, Palestine, and the US. And they created an innovative software model. It was called Active, was the name of the software program they used, that they developed and then used. And what they wanted it to do is 2 things. One, synergize a host of media so it could take in photos, video, audio, and print, of course. But also, they wanted to create a democratic, open news site. So they had this idea for an open publishing newswire. This is it, right? So you go on the site, you publish something. It's a set of pictures. It's a theoretical analysis. It's a video. And the moment you publish it, it goes up, and you see it instantaneously. And then those stories that get upvoted go into the central column as main features, right? So that was their vision of how to create an open, democratic news site. Now, it's 2017. This doesn't seem all that interesting, right? But in '99, it really was, right? So it set the technological rubric for all the sort of emergent social media we see today, from Facebook to citizen journalism and blogging to Twitter. And it's not only that it was maybe an idea that's time had come, It's also that the programmer, one of the programmers involved in building this website was one of the programmers involved in building Twitter. So it wasn't just ideological relationship that the internet was offering us something, it was also a material relationship. Programmers were involved in multiple projects. And one thing about this website, it was brand new, and over that first week it got 1.5 million original hits and outpaced CNN, which was the biggest news site at the time, in its first week of existence. So this energetic inauguration of what became the Indian media movement presaged a new era of grassroots citizen journalism and globalized resistance, which grew far beyond what the original folks. I would try to shut off Skype, but it's beyond me to go out and do it, so we'll just hope they don't do that again. So it grew far beyond what people imagined. So after Seattle, independent media centers started germinating throughout the industrialized nations, right? First in DC, then in Philadelphia, then in Los Angeles, and then over the pond into England and Europe, right? And at first it followed a particular protest circuit. So the global justice movement in 2000, for those who know, was really blossoming. There was a lot of resistance. It wasn't unlike what we're seeing right now. So every couple weeks or a month or two, there was a protest, a major protest. And so when there was a protest, they also developed an independent media center. So Seattle was 99. At the end of 99, in March and April of 2000 was the World Bank and IMF meetings in DC. They created an independent media center. In the summer, there was both the Republican National Convention in Philly and the Democratic National Convention in LA, and they created two centers, one in Philly and one in LA. And then it went to Europe following the G8 and the World Economic Forum, so it sort of developed in Europe following that same path. But then at some point it went beyond this protest circuit, and it sort of hit, I'm not a huge fan of Gladwell, but nonetheless it hit this tipping point, right? And these centers started bursting up everywhere. And they ended up creating a loosely federated, so they were loosely connected, non-corporate media and communication structure. From 99 to 2010, a new independent media center was developed once every 12 days. There were, at its height in 2006, there were 200 centers creating news in 30 languages on 6 continents, and every platform on a budget of like $300,000 or $400,000 a year, mostly driven by volunteer labor. It was, by my research, the largest non-corporate, non-state media network in the world. And it was global, right? I mean, there's definitely skews heavy towards the industrialized nations, but there was a strong South American influence. There was some in Africa, and there were certain parts of Asia where there was indie media, certainly not in China, which isn't a surprise. So my research began shortly after the Republican National Convention, which happened in Philly in 2000. Like Seattle and Philly, there was a citywide buzz around the development of the Independent Media Center. They created a newspaper called The Young Convention, which is pictured there. They had a low-power FM radio station, which still broadcasts to this day, and has a footprint primarily in West Philadelphia. They had a website, etc. And actually, Amy Goodman was down at the Republican National Convention for Democracy Now!, and she did her first video broadcast of Democracy Now! In the Independent Media Center, which was in downtown Philly in 2000. So I began my study a few years after the Republican National Convention, and it started as a place-based urban ethnography. I wanted to do an ethnography on social movements as they intersect with technology, and so I wanted to focus on the Philadelphia Independent Media Center. So I was place-based. I was a journalist. I did dispatch. I helped do software programming. I was a participant observer, the way ethnographers are supposed to be, and I did that for 2 years. But at some point, I also became very interested. As I mentioned, this became a global movement, a global kind of formation, and so I became interested in how the global operated. Right, so I became a part of the global listservs, editorial listservs, technology listservs, where the decision-making apparatuses for this global project, which at this point had 200 independent media centers. I also was interested in the history that led to it, so I went to Mexico, did a bunch of interviews there, and I also looked closely at the 90s. Before this emerged, there was a bunch of experiments throughout the United States where activists were trying to figure out how to use the internet. And so I looked really closely at these experiments to see how the logic of these experiments played into this development. what I witnessed while looking at this is what I think we now see much more clearly, all of us, which was that there's a sea change. There was arguably a sea change in how activists were doing the work they did, right? Their logic that drove them, the vision they had for the world they were trying to create. And so my research sort of transmuted from one particular focus on Philly IMC, Philadelphia Independent Media Center, to trying to understand this broader logic. What drives it? How does it connect with the changes in technology? How does it intersect with changes in capitalism also? So in order to get analytic purchase, as I said earlier, I use the term cyber left to sort of help us get in touch with this. Now, cyber left is a term I use to pull together all the fragments in the strategies and practice of contemporary resistance and show how they actually become a coherent logic. If you look at each strand, you say, what do I see here? It's a picture I can't make out. But I'll argue to you that if you try to pull the logic together, you actually see something quite coherent. I also use the term cyber left historically, right? Things kill me. To enable us to think about it in relationship to the history of social movements in the United States. So one caveat, and I'll make another in a minute, but with the growing fervor of technological utopianism that came on the heels of the Arab Spring and Occupy to a lesser degree, the use of cyber is complicated, right? Because I would argue it overestimates the role of technology, and I'll explain why in a minute. But I want to make clear that I don't use cyber to say social movements have moved online. I also don't want to argue that our lives are changing in a massively qualitative way because of this networking power of Facebook or Twitter. And I also am not going to argue to you that the changes that we're seeing are good. I think there's a real set of questions about whether the changes are positive. But what cyber helps us do is get in touch with a set of processes and practices that are particular to contemporary movements that are different from historically. And while I use cyber to capture the new dynamic of contemporary movements, my research is really focused on chronicling the American left, particularly. Historians of the American left generally speak of two central phases of social movement history, the old left and the new left. The old left emerged in the early part of the 20th century and ended at the end of World War II. It was influenced by Marxism primarily, and the Bolshevik Revolution in particular. So what happened in Soviet Russia. And it was focused in America on the development of trade unionism and the development of political parties, and was driven by this concept of the antagonism between the bourgeoisie and proletariat. So these are a set of the things that really marked how the old left operated, the dominant trends, right? In the post-war period, post-World War II, the US government waged war on critical old left institutions like the Communist Party, but also labor. They forced people to sign loyalty oaths saying that they were not a part of the institutions of this period. And so that, along with the very real horrors of Stalinism, led to an end to this period. Most of the institutions died, and they died in one way or the other, or leaders who were part of this, who were maybe in the CIO, were forced out. So the old left ended, right? But out of the ashes of the old left, as Robin D.G. Kelly argues, the civil rights movement emerged and acted as a critical bridge to what we know as the new left, the movements of the 60s. So in the 60s, and it's important to note that many of the civil rights leaders were trained as part of the old left. So I mark A.R. Philip Randolph. He was a person who came out of the old left and then became a leader of the civil rights movement. And then the movements of the civil rights movement became the critical kind of organizing vision for what then emerged as the new left in the 60s. So the new left emerged on the heels of the civil rights movement, but was also heavily influenced by Mao and the Maoist revolution in China. And it challenged primarily the dogma of the old left. New left activists questioned the central role of class, or particularly the industrial proletariat, and they articulated a host of what we would now call intersectional concerns around gender and racial equality, but also around the Vietnam War and US imperialism. So, following those two stages, what I argue generally is that we're seeing the outlines of a new phase, the cyber left, which has taken the shape as global, tends to be global, that's actually changing, digitized, radically democratic, and is influenced by heavily by the Zapatistas, which again is ironic because it's a very technologically oriented phase of movements, and it finds its inspiration in a peasant movement in southern Mexico. So I do want to make one more caveat, which is there are real problems in thinking through stages like this. And I'll name two. One problem with thinking through stages is that you miss historical continuity. So that what happened in one period actually leads into the next period, which leads into the next period. And when you think through stages, you miss that historical continuity. So that's one major problem. And the other major problem is that in pulling out the dominant trends, you miss the dissonance, right? What were the countervailing trends of a period? So if we talk about the old left as dominated primarily by the development of the CIO or the Communist Party, what were some of the countervailing trends that you missed by picking out the dominant trends, right? So when we think in stages, I think we have to be really attentive to those facts. And here I follow a scholar named Frederick Jameson. I argue that not thinking through stages at all doesn't allow you to understand what the hegemonic characteristics of a particular moment are. So you need to try to figure out what those hegemonic characteristics are, but then do it with a real kind of thoughtfulness that understands the challenges to those dominant characteristics. Accordingly, in The Rise and Fall of the American Left, historian J.P. Diggins takes up the question of social movement periodization in his analysis of the character and intellectual temperament of the U.S. left across the 20th century. Diggins argues that, quote, a generation is not simply a people coexisting in the same period. What identifies a group as belonging to a particular generation are both a shared perspective on common historical problems and a similar strategy of action. Diggins goes on to articulate that a generation is forged by the spirit of trying to negate what is in an attempt to create what ought to be. So there's this famous kind of philosophical idea of the is and the ought, right? It's dialectical, and it's also Marcusian, who I did do some work on after this. And so the idea is simple, that you try to imagine the contours of a better world against the actually existing world you exist in, right? And so there are famous social movement sayings that play this, right? So the famous situation is saying, underneath the streets of each, right? So against the world you live in, this is from France, is the world you imagine you could have. Or the global justice movement's famous saying was, another world is possible. So these sayings all play to this spirit, right? But I think that Diggins is missing part. So yes, activists do figure out their future against the actually existing world, both economic world, the social and cultural world they inherit, the technological world that they exist within. But I also argue that they make their decisions and they build their logic of the future they're building also through the history that they inherit of other social movements. So again, to move back to this, there's this multilateral dialogue, both between your material present and also between the history that you've inherited. So in this sense, the old left put forward a science. It was a very scientific vision of Marxism, and they did that against what they saw was a romantic notion of socialism that had dominated the previous periods in the late 19th century. But they were also thinking of the science of Marxism as it pertained to Fordism, right? So the way capitalism was operating was there was Taylorism, there was management of workers in the factory, and the way they imagined building social change was very much in relationship to the economic engines of that period. Likewise, the new left put forward an existential and individualistic ethic largely in some of their movements as a challenge both to the very hierarchical organizations of the old left. The old left was very hierarchical, but also as a push against the conformity of what's known as the company man, or what marked mass society, right? So in my work, building on this as the 21st century unfolds, and I'm trying to understand how the cyber left is both a reaction to the history it's inherited, but also is embedded in the technology that it's and the way capitalism operates. So how does that operate on activists today is the question I really ask in looking at the cyber left. So to that end, I maintain that there are three core characteristics that we find in most cyber left formations, whether we're talking about indie media, the Zapatistas to a lesser degree, many of the global justice movement organizations, World Social Forum process, but then even the more recent period of protest. I think Black Lives Matter to some degree, Occupy for sure, they all operated within a certain set of logical parameters. And so the three core ones in my mind are governance, the local, national, and global application of direct democracy and consensus decision-making process. As a governing doctrine, this means that every member has a right to equal participation in every decision. Accordingly, there's no hierarchy, there are no elections against, say, a party, right? There's nothing like that we would see in most of these things. There's no executive director. And it does harken back to a concept of prefigurative politics, which grew out in the 60s, which means you prefigure in the movement, you create in the movement, prefigure in the movement the kind of world you want to see. So the same relations you have in the work you do is it prefigures the kind of world you want to create. And in my research, I saw both on indie media and on Occupy. I'd be in these democratic, for indie media, I would be in these chat rooms with hundreds of activists at 3 in the morning, because you're trying to have someone in Tokyo on at the same time as somebody in LA or New York. And they're all chatting, and they're trying to make a decision about how big the banner on the website should be. 300 people, right? Or in Occupy Philly, which I also did research on, 500 people at a General Assembly trying to make a democratic decision about exactly where the latrine should go, right? So it's a concept of democracy all the way down, which we'll get to what the problems with that. But nonetheless, that's a governing doctrine, how movements should operate. Structure, they tend to be, and majority of the time, decentralized, networked organizational structures. Self-organizing, and with no hierarchy amongst the different nodes, right? So you have a Philly IMC, and you have a New York IMC or a Sao Paulo IMC, and they can interrelate, but no particular node is in charge of the other node. Same with Occupy, right? I think arguably, though there's certain leadership in Black Lives Matter, it's the same with BLM, right? The Philly Black Lives Matter does not have any say on how the New York Black Lives Matter operates, right? So it's very decentralized as opposed to historically. And then the strategy, which is to create platforms and processes where different fragmented struggles or the intersections of these struggles can be networked together without one particular movement in the lead. That's not true of Black Lives Matter, clearly, which puts criminal justice, police brutality at front, right, and particularly how it impacts black people. But most of the movements tend to operate within this idea of making a movement of movement. There's not one struggle in the front, as with the old left, which certainly put the working class at the lead. So if we use a fine-grained lens and look at these attributes, it's hard to make out a coherent logic, but taken together, they form a discernible pattern of action captured by a desire to build a new world order without hierarchy or entrenched forms of power. For me, I argue that this is a logic of horizontality. This is the logic that dominates almost all of these movements, right? And it's organized around, as I said, a desire to build a world without hierarchy. Theorists have described this as a preference for flat structures. And the logic of horizontality is clearly present in the strategy, structure, and governance of the cyber left, and marked by all those different parts of what I just marked. So, but it's not just, again, the indie media movement. I think it was clearly what happened, certainly in a lot of what happened in Middle East and North Africa, not all of it for sure. Certainly clear in Occupy, certainly clear to some level in Black Lives Matter. I think there are aspects of that in the new Trump resistance, but that's unclear to me as it's just emerging, so it's hard to tell how that's going to develop. So the last thing I want to do, and then I'll stop and hopefully we can have a conversation, is Mark. So there have been a couple theorists who are arguing around this, right? And so I'm not alone on that, but most of the theorists of social movements, they think about this logic of horizontality, this deep democratic process, and they just want to write about it and give it a big hug, right? So they are so happy with it, right, that it's not, they're not putting on a very good critical hat as scholars, right? So one scholar says we're going to change the world without taking power. That's one of the key books of this period, right? And so there's a real problem to that, right? That's not the role of scholars. Scholars both analyze, both describe what they're saying, and then they go into an analysis mode. And the majority of the scholarship is very weak on analysis here. So in my work, what I've tried to do is both pull out these attributes and then show their strengths and weaknesses. So to the strengths, really briefly, the self-organizing, decentralized process of these movements allows for really quick growth. Indie media, as I mentioned, exploded. 200 sites, one every 6 days, and they had to shut down and not take in new independent media centers for like 2 years. Occupy, we saw how that exploded, right? Or even actually the airport resistance that we saw how that exploded just, a week ago. And that so allows for really quick growth with no centralized planning, just a set of ideas that people take hold of, right? That's powerful. Another thing that's powerful is the deep democratic process allows people to build strong collective identity, right? The more you're involved with decision making, the more you're ready to really engage something. And then also, there were some real problems with the hierarchy of old movements. And so some of this concept of leaderlessness has been a pushback against what were real problems of overly hierarchical movements that put certain people at the lead. All of those are very positive attributes that have emerged. But there are also some really deep problems. And I got to this, so I'm studying the global justice movement and the indie media movement, and I'm in the field, and these are the most vibrant movements in the country, and arguably in the world at that time. And by the time I'm done with my research 2 years later, they're basically dead. And so at some point I had to step back and say, hey, what happened here? How did this happen? And so asking that question enabled me to sort of begin to understand some of the real problems. So I'm going to lay them out for you real quick. One is a lack of analysis of capitalism, of class, of racial dynamics, of gender dynamics, right, within these movements. And the real problem, what that really leads to is if you don't have analysis of how the world operates, how power operates in the world within your movement, right, you don't create the programs that lift up those most dispossessed. And if you don't create programs that lift up those most dispossessed, those with the most cultural capital dominate, right? And so in the case of indie media and also Occupy for sure, what you saw was a domination of white college-educated men, time and again, right? And the reason again is that they didn't figure out how to understand, yes, we are the 99%, right? But not everyone within the 99% is structured in the same way to the system, right? And so if you don't make that analysis, and then you don't figure out a program for your work that lifts up that analysis, those with the most cultural capital will lead. In the case of indie media, it's those with the most technological skills, those who could go to meetings and be unpaid for multiple hours, right? Those were the people who ended up dominating, and they dominated because of their class background, right? Period, end of sentence. And I want to mark here that we could say this is a moral problem, right? And we could make an argument that there's a moral problem here. But what I would argue to you also is it's a political and strategic problem for these movements. Because when one part of the class or one part of a movement leads it, they don't know how to lift up the other parts. And then the movement quickly becomes isolated, right? Often shrill. And it's isolated and shrill often because it doesn't know how to lift up all parts, right? Because it doesn't create a program that lifts up all parts, because one group dominates, and they dominate from their position vis-a-vis the social structure. So this leads to a second problem time and again that I've seen, which is a techno-utopianism, a clear overassessment of the role of technology. And this follows the first problem very directly, right? If your real reason you're in a movement is not because of your own material dispossession, but because of a set of ideological feelings you have about the world and your own self-fulfillment, and you're not fighting over putting a meal on the table tomorrow, arguably, you tend to overassess the role of technology in the work, right? And so what movements tended to do was say technology is the answer, as opposed to putting technology within communities and saying, how do we use this technology to lift up the problems, right? And so technology was completely overassessed. So for indie media, they made the most amazing websites. As I argued to you, some of these websites became the basis of Facebook.